does worry me that the Human Rights Convention, and from that the Refugee Convention of 1951, are somehow being talked about they're unmoded, outdated, old-fashioned documents. Because I truly feel that that convention and the 1951 Refugee Convention is foundational to our humanity. And I think it's very, very important that we keep people and humanity at the heart of asylum. That no matter where you come from, no matter what your race or ethnicity is, where you are geolocated, you have the human right to seek asylum. And for that to be done fairly and humanely, and for that to be used as a confusing piece of political rhetoric, I think is unconscionable. And I think it separates us. When refugees and asylum seekers are treated inhumanely, it encourages the local community to treat one another in an inhumane way. I think it invites an inhumane discourse into civil society, and I think that we're doing that to our own detriment.
It's been a bit of a mad year on the road for you. You've been to Jordan, you've been to Niger, you've been to South Sudan. What have you learnt over the course of this year? And particularly, I suppose, what do you think might surprise people?
Well, I mean, I've been working with UNHCR since 2015, and it's always a privilege to go into the field with them. I was revisiting some places that I'd been several years earlier because I wanted to reconnect with the refugees who I'd found so generous and so inspiring. You know, their sense of resilience and keeping hope alive in very difficult circumstances. And so I would say, for example, going back to Jordan, going back to Zartri refugee camp, which hosts, over 80,000 refugees. At the time that I saw them initially and met them, they were in a state of shock. You know, and if you stand in Zartri refugee camp, the strange thing is that you can see the hills of Syria. So they can see how close home is. So they were talking about returning home. And in the years that had passed, life had gone on. So there was a village there. And that through sort of in-kind support and government support, they'd built a solar array. Every caravan that they were living in had a water tank. So there was infrastructure that had been built to support these people and to take the pressure off the host community. But I think the biggest takeaway for me was that the young children that I had met sort of 7 years earlier were now approaching the end of their secondary education, and they were at a place where they couldn't imagine a future, because the opportunity for them to be educated in any tertiary way was gone. So they were no longer talking about returning home, because the Syrian crisis has been so protracted. They were talking about resettlement, which of course then from a European perspective, people think, well, they can't come here. They're going to take our jobs, they're going to take our homes, we don't have the ability to take them in, and they're going to die in a leaky boat. So it really reminded me how important it is for the European community and for the European Parliament and for countries within Europe and beyond to support refugees at the point of origin and transit, as well as the point of destination. Because if you can support people in the work that UNHCR does at that point of crisis, then they are less likely to make those dangerous journeys. 69% of people who are forced to flee their homes do stay in neighbouring countries because they want to return home to their families, to their communities, to their houses.
You started as a goodwill ambassador for the UNHCR back in 2015, which seems like a bit of a lifetime away. It was the year of Merkel's famous Wir schaffen das, in that first wave of refugees from Syria, the big wave that arrived in Europe. In that time and since then, it feels a little bit like the politics of the refugee crisis in Europe has changed. What do you think has changed, and how do you explain it, and what can be done?
I do think that people by and large are generous. I think it's when we separate ourselves from the beneficial nature of welcoming refugees, I think, and get caught up in the sloganism. And also when I feel, there's a great deal of, hardship that people are experiencing in their own community, and when they feel that their own governments aren't looking after their needs, then refugees have always historically been scapegoated, and we have seen historically where that scapegoating leads. And we don't want to find ourselves back in that place, because I think those moments are not moments of pride for Europe or for the States or for Australia. I think if we dehumanise our relationship to the refugee, to the displacement crisis, we dehumanise ourselves at our own peril. And I think, therefore, we can take responsibility, because I think when we look at the overwhelming figures, it's understandable that people say, well, what can I do about it? I think you can challenge that xenophobic rhetoric. You can encounter a refugee and realise, in fact, that there's so much you can learn from them, so much, and they're so willing to give back to the host community. But when they are separated out, when they are put into camps, when they are put onto barges, when they are put into a third country solution, which I know from the Australian context does not work, it costs billions of dollars, and it also traumatises the people who are forced to guard them. I mean, it is a disaster all round. It is an unworkable policy when you're separated from that problem, it breeds discontent on all sides. It is not a solution. It is causing yet another problem.
We're here talking about your work with the UNHCR, but of course your day job is as an actor, as a producer. Is there something you think that you can be doing in that job to take people's stories with you and to share them with the world, some of the stories of the people you've met over the course of this year?
Yes, look, I never see theatre, novels, films as being pieces of agitprop. I think there are some incredible documentaries, which is often the way we get our long-form news, because our news outlets are so often compromised, or we are sceptical of them. You know, you need to get your news from so many different sources. No, no offence, but I do think it's interesting. If you look at films that were made during the Second World War, they inadvertently somehow talked about the war. They might have talked about it obliquely, or they might have talked about it directly. And I do find it fascinating that, given that the two crises, the biggest crises facing us as a species, the climate change and the displacement crisis, that they aren't fed more deeply into the stories we tell as a texture, that we somehow sort of put them to one side. I do think that works of art, films, however you want to refer to them, provide a platform, an opportunity and a coming together to talk about things that are really difficult to talk about. Not necessarily to find an answer, but to keep the dialogue alive. And I think that's what organisations like the UN, I think that's probably what I see my role as a Goodwill Ambassador is doing, is to try and keep provide a human space to talk about really complex issues, so that people from all sides feel heard, people who feel fearful of refugees who they may never have encountered, or refugees who feel like their voices aren't being heard, that they can come together in a space and have a dialogue. And I think that can sometimes happen in film. Not in an agitprop way, but in a provocative, warm